Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. She could have had it easy by just doing the minimum. Instead, she decides to do even less than the minimum. I quit. Karen reported me to HR for it. I was the director of sales ops for a $40 million a year software company. Karen was on my team. We processed purchase orders. Karen had a small vehicle accident that put her in a neck brace. She also needed once-weekly physical therapy appointments and had some restrictions on duties, all of which I accommodated, no issue. Despite meeting her needs, Karen decided coming into work was optional. HR noticed that she was repeatedly absent from work for 3 to 4 days at a time, multiple weeks in a row. They did not give me details, but told me documentation from her doctor did not justify all of these absences. To make matters worse, Karen would never give notice that she was going to be out, and sometimes would just no-show without ever calling, nor indicate how long she'd be out. HR eventually told Karen she needed to either attend more work regularly or get a doctor to sign off on short-term disability. This worked for me. I'd rather Karen take extended time off so I could get a temp to take her responsibilities than be absent frequently with no warning. Karen's original doctor would not document a need for disability, so she found a doctor who would. She bragged to the team that she found a doc that would sign off on anything, so Karen went on disability and I was able to get a temp to cover her until she returned. Even though coworkers who kept in contact told me Karen was going to clubs and dancing and such, I didn't care. That was between her and HR. For now, at least, the work was getting done. The time period of Karen's short-term disability eventually expired. At this point, she either had to come back to work or go on long-term disability so I could replace her permanently. Karen's sign anything doctor would not give her documentation for long-term disability, so Karen grudgingly came back to work. She quickly went back to being absent all the time. She also refused to do even the basic duties of her job. I went to HR and told them things were not working out and that I wanted to replace her. They were on board with this plan. HR brought Karen in for the talk, but Karen flipped out and said she'd sue. Suddenly, HR was not on board. Didn't matter that Karen really had no legal standing, just the threat of a lawsuit made HR decide it was more important to make Karen happy than to let me have a functional ops department. In one instance, I asked Karen to do purchase order review and she complained to HR about me bossing her around. I'm her boss. HR told me that I could no longer give assignments or work duties to Karen. WTF. When I said that was fine, as long as they let me hire someone else to do Karen's job, they refused to give me a rec for a new employee. This went on for months, and Karen quickly learned she could complain to HR about anything and get her way. You wouldn't believe the accommodation she was given. Meanwhile, she made no effort to hide that she was not really injured anymore, was barely coming to work, but was still getting paid. She even encouraged other team members to take advantage of this loophole she'd found. Then one day during month-end crunch, Karen had not come in or called, so I called and asked her if she planned to work that day. It was a simple question, carefully crafted to be neutral in tone. She told HR that I had harassed her with my phone call. I got written up, so I immediately put in my 2-week notice. Not going to deal with my career being effed by a woman who had worked maybe 6 days in a month, especially when I gave 60 to 70 hours a week to the company. With me suddenly gone, the sales ops fell apart. Purchase orders were not going through. To address this emergency, a company senior VP took over sales ops until my replacement could be found. HR was certainly not going to tell this guy he couldn't give Karen duties, so Karen actually had to work. About a month after I quit, Karen got my home number and called me. Furious that she now had to actually work, she told me she was going to report me to HR for a company I no longer worked for. And sure enough, she did exactly that. I kept in touch with members of my old team, and they told me she was laughed out of the HR office. But here's where it gets absurd. Karen called me again, cursing, screaming, and threatening me, and demanded I give her the contact information for HR at my new company. She was going to report me to a department that had no idea who she was, nor had any jurisdiction over her complaints. The stupidity was unbelievable, and I giggled at her right up until I hung up and blocked her. Last I heard, Karen was finally fired, got 0 unemployment benefits, and ended up moving her and her kids in with her mom. She's so dumb. And our next story. HOA power trip story with a happy ending. Backstory. A few years ago, I bought my first house in a medium-sized 500 to 1,000 homes neighborhood in a southern state. It had an HOA, but I actually picked the neighborhood because they had the lowest HOA dues in the city, the fewest rules, and the house was by far the nicest one I could afford in my budget. After a few weeks, I get a violation notice from the HOA telling me that I had 2 violations needing correction. My lawn was not green enough. My trash cans were too close to my driveway. I was thoroughly confused about number 1 as it was February, in the middle of winter, so of course my lawn was dead, like pretty much everyone else's, so I'd assumed that either this was a mistake or an existing offense from the previous owner. As for the trash cans, I kept them on the side of my house, and I think when the HOA came by, my trash cans stuck out past the side wall 1 foot. So how dare I? I shrugged them off and continued on. Come March, I got another notice, this time fining me for both violations. Each one cost me $100, and they wanted the money in 2 weeks. I was pissed. This has made no sense, and I was not about to let them just try to get money for BS violations, so I called the management company that worked with the board to get them appealed. The lady told me that I needed to appeal directly to the board and that I could do so in the next annual meeting in a few days. So I, of course, showed up at the meeting. Prior to it starting, I met with a few homeowners and learned that they were all there for similar BS violations and were pissed off too. I then talked with one of the members of the board about the fine appeals process. He was an older guy in his 70s with short gray hair and a very worn and angry face. He asked what I was getting fined for, and when I told him, he just looked at me and said, "You should get fined for that. Young people like you not taking care of their homes is the whole reason I got on this board. Learn to be a better property owner." This dude was the VP of a volunteer board telling me that I didn't know how to take care of my house? What a sad life. The meeting then started, and the moderator mentioned that since this was an annual meeting, we'd be voting on 3 of the 5 board members. They had some applicants to the board, and we could also nominate someone today. That's when I had the idea of how I could get my revenge. When the election part of the meeting came, I nominated myself, gave some short BS speech about HOAs are not here to make money and that I want to serve my community. I won in a landslide, and you could see the board members getting annoyed because they'd scowled during my speech. After the meeting, I appealed my violations in a very elegant way, and they agreed to waive my trash can violation. As for the grass one, apparently, since I had weeds growing in my yard, like tiny patch in the corner, they were still fining me because the weeds were turning yellow after I sprayed them. I was dumbfounded how they could get away with this, but they used a technicality in the bylaws that I had signed, so I ended up losing $100. Revenge. I'll be honest, I'd not expected this to work. After joining the board of 5, including myself, I was appointed secretary and had to help maintain meeting notes and review records. They specifically told me that I was not allowed to propose new policies, but I could vote on new ones proposed by the VP or president, which I later learned was actually a violation of their own rules. I voted every new rule down as long as I was in that position. I decided that my best course of action was to listen to how the others operated and look for an opening to get each of them off the board. The first opening came when the president, who literally looked like the most Karen woman ever, mentioned that she had wanted to fine for flowers that were not neutral color. Basically, if a homeowner wanted to add something like turquoise flowers, we would fine them. She apparently had a neighbor that had flowers that she didn't like and wanted to use the board to stop them. It's pretty insane. I then started my revenge on her. I started a message thread on Slack, since that's how we communicated, with the other board members and asked what they had thought about her policy and reasoning. After far too much deliberation, 2 of them honestly thought that this was okay. We agreed that the policy went too far. I then made a long post in the main channel telling her that her actions were not only wrong, but that she should be excused from the board. When she inevitably flipped out, I called a board meeting in the following week, and the other 4 board members voted her off for targeting a community member for personal gain. She gave a sob story about how the board was her life and that the neighborhood was like her child, but I didn't care. That was 1 down. I convinced one of my good neighbor friends to join a little later on to take her spot. The next members I targeted were the treasurer and director, as I wanted to save the VP for last. They were actually pretty easy to get off the board because they were very easily swayed by public opinion. So I made a fake account on Nextdoor and waited until spring when most of the violations go out. When the letters went out, I looked for angry posts on Nextdoor. I then would comment on each one, giving them the first names of the 2 board members as the culprits and told them to come to the next HOA meeting to appeal. It worked far better than I had expected. During the next meeting, over 50 people showed up and called out those by name. It was glorious. During the open session, community members grilled those 2 for their poor policies, even though they didn't make most of them. The VP, now president, after the other one resigned, tried to defend them, but ultimately failed. The 2 members were so distraught after the meeting, and I told them that maybe they should resign, and they both did. That was 2 more down, both of which were replaced by a couple who came to the same meeting and wanted to get rid of these rules. Finally, the board had been flipped to 4 out of 5 people wanting to get rid of all these dumb rules. The president, however, was still the same old, angry, hateful man. He tried to add more rules to increase violation revenue, and we voted him down every time. He started to get annoyed, but stayed steadfast to the board. I tried a lot of tactics to get him to leave, and not much swayed him. A few months went by, and we started with a new management company. They had a much better style of property management and a website for looking through our community's records, as well as automated reports. When we got our first fines report, I hit pay dirt. The president's house appeared, and he owed around $10,000. Apparently, he had open violations that he had never paid, and the other management company hid it from the board for him, since he'd been on the board for close to 7 years. So I looked into remedies. Since his fines were over $3,000, our bylaw stated that a majority vote of the board could start an HOA foreclosure on the home, which I still think is insane that HOAs can do that. So I got all the docs together and double-checked with the new management company that the fines were correct, which they confirmed. I called an emergency board session, presented the information, and 4 out of 5 of us voted to start the foreclosure process. The president got angry, cursed, and left the meeting early. We were informed a few days later that the president had resigned, paid his fine, and put his house up for sale. While I'm sad we couldn't force a foreclosure, at least he was off the board. I'm currently president to this day, and I've reduced the fining policy to be a maximum of $400, and homeowners can appeal anytime they wish digitally. In addition, I've banned any grass fines until May, and trash can violations have been super relaxed. When the one board member said that the board was her whole life and the neighborhood was like her child, she showed the exact problem with some HOAs. Some of them have never had any power before. Many have nothing more important to do, so they have to micromanage the HOA and nitpick everything to death. I love how you turned it into a reasonable program. Well done, OP. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.